Now, flat Earth is way too stupid for me but maybe someone can answer this. I don't see what the benefit of making me think that is, since I don't give a rat's ass what shape the Earth is and no one else does. So I don't care about any you got some math about why it's not round? I don't care. Tell me why they're doing this, because that's more than the network of the cabal. That's way more people than that you need to pull that off. You need all the pilots and ship captains, everybody else. Okay, they're all in on it. But why?
I'm so glad you asked. Especially because you guys already know the answer.
I've got one that can sing.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
So recently somebody had asked me in a comment if I had chosen to stop making videos about the topic of flat Earth. And my response, I think, was something along the lines of no, but I have admittedly kind of pulled away from a lot of the discussion on flat Earth that you kind of tend to find in a lot of the circles and channels that either get caught up in just debating all the same old questions about the model, especially since that whole dubious final experiment nonsense in Antarctica, and a lot of people just being consumed with arguing over whether it was really filmed in Antarctica or, CGI or green screen, and all that I kind of just really got pretty tired of. And sort of by extension, just the whole YouTube and social media feud that's arisen over the last few years between all these flat Earth debunker channels, going after the Flerfs all the time, and it just inevitably devolves into this very juvenile sporting match of trying to dunk on the other team. And even though I know I've been guilty of getting sucked into that at times myself, so I guess I've just been trying to learn to not get sucked into that sort of culture war junk in alternative media, specifically with flat Earth. And I think especially trying to argue with guys like Simon Dan or that MC Toon guy or Dave McKeegan, all these people that are just they're not questioning anything about the mainstream narratives on any front that I can see. So they're all in on evolution. They're all in on, everything science. COVID came and went and they didn't even blink. So to me, that's just a complete waste of time battling against all those people. But on that note, when I came across this live stream conversation between Kurt Metzger and Dyer recently, and Kurt brought up flat Earth, and he asked what I at least hope was a sincere question about, why would they endeavor to concoct such a massive deception about the nature of the world that we live in? And so the only reason I'm choosing to make a response to that video here is because I've actually been following both Metzger and Dyer for quite a while, and, I appreciate their combined knowledge about a whole host of different topics, within the broader scope of conspiracy research, and particularly their focus on media and propaganda and mind control, and how all such things play a massive role in how the public at large is manipulated into all sorts of false political and spiritual narratives. So, and since we're already on the same page on so many levels, it's okay, this feels like a worthwhile thing to interject into. Dyer probably needs no introduction to most of you guys. He's been putting out books and videos on this topic for years now. And Kurt Metzger, I gotta admit, he might be my favorite comedian out there right now, if not ever. He is hilarious. Probably mostly due to the types of topics he covers, and just his overall sense of humor is kind of the only kind of humor I can even really appreciate these days. It's based on like the hypocrisy and the hubris of man and the insanity of clown world. And, the jokes kind of just write themselves, which is basically what I like about his comedy. And, I started watching him during COVID sometime when he was, as he's been co-hosting on the Jimmy Dore show, and they cover a lot of very pertinent news topics. And lately, Kurt's kind of been going on a podcast, rampage as a guest all over the place, and gotten to kind of get a general sense of where he's coming from in terms of his like professional background as a writer and doing stand-up, but also growing up as a Jehovah's Witness and then being an atheist, and now more recently he's been very open about how he's at least more theistic in his worldview. And it's been actually really cool to kind of see that transition. And so but he talks a lot about his research into esoteric things and secret societies and MK Ultra and all this stuff. So the conversation between him and Dyer overall was really interesting, as I imagined it would be. But when he brought up the flat earth question, and specifically the why question, I was like, yeah, that's really the part of the whole cosmology debate that is the most important. And yet, sadly, it often gets very little attention by a lot of the more well-known flat earth voices out there. Or they kind of give a very surface-level treatment of it, repeating just some sort of vague lines about how it's to hide God or hide the creator. Though, a whole lot of the time, they don't really seem that interested in discussing who that God really is or what the whole purpose of knowing him really is, as much as they are in just debating, the model or repeating a lot of the sort of generic new agey type of proclamations about reclaiming your own sovereignty and divine purpose and all this kind of stuff. They'll talk about being special and created and how evolution is a lie, which of course is a big part of it. But ultimately, there are a lot of flat earthers out there who will talk about God, or even happy to discuss the Bible passages that point to the earth being an enclosed, fixed realm. But they still don't necessarily want to get into that controversial Jesus character, or the gospel thing that he was always talking about. And so right up front, I'm just going to spoil the answer to the why question right here, and say that without the truth of Jesus, not only is there no point to exposing the lies of cosmology, but ultimately none of our conspiracy research or esoteric spiritual rabbit holes or knowledge about the New World Order amounts to a hill of beans in the end. And I don't know if Dyer or Metzger will actually see this video. I certainly do hope so. And, I'm endeavoring to address them both directly as two guys that I in fact respect a great deal. And, hopefully they do see it. But even if they don't, it still works as like a template for addressing this why question. Why would they lie about the shape of the earth? Because I know tons of people out there who are similarly very well informed about all these different deceptions, about the cabal and, all kinds of conspiracy topics. But they're still in that place of like finding flat earth a bit too, too stupid for me, as Metzger put it. So I'm addressing his question directly, but also just to whoever might even be thinking the same way. And as a side note, I've actually been pretty stoked to hear Kurt mentioning recently that he's become a fan of guys like Gary Wayne, with all of his Nephilim and Bible research, but also Nathan Reynolds, who has, one of the most amazing testimonies out there. And he talks unashamedly about things like satanic ritual abuse and mind control, and overall just how the invisible spiritual realm is very, very real. And also Kurt turned me onto that Control Alt History channel, which does really good work too. So, I'm a fan of his work and his research. So that's basically what I was getting at when I said that Dyer and Metzger already know the answer. Because despite what other issues we might disagree on, they both certainly do believe in a spiritual dimension to reality. And they've spent years contemplating how media and culture and government have molded public perception of that reality. And that is basically the reason I find listening to both those guys interesting, is because they've spent a lot of time researching it and connecting a lot of dots in terms of the propaganda. In fact, it was almost kind of ironic that in that very same episode, Dyer and Metzger are talking about how today we're already at the level where MK Ultra is happening on a worldwide scale, like a population level scale, as evidenced by things like COVID 1984, or all these false flag operations, or, just the funneling of entire generations into this new cyber pseudo-reality fueled by social media and digital stimulation. And there's so many examples, but in other words, these are two guys who know a lot about the subject of mind control, to the point of saying that, like, yes, it can work on this massive scale where people don't obviously realize they're being mind controlled or realize they're being manipulated. Doesn't mean they're all in on the same doesn't mean everybody's lying. And it's the same thing with cosmology. The why question is undoubtedly more important than, squabbling over all the little details that are, supposedly so far away out in outer space anyways that it's realistically isn't going to impact your day-to-day life anyways. If you're getting into like all the physics of the orbits of things and, it's like, how does it really impact society? How does it really impact culture and spirituality and, why? What is the point? What is the propagandistic function of lying about outer space? That is the question that I've kind of been obsessed with for about 10 years, and so that's what I love to talk about, and that's why I'm making this video.
She thinks she missed the train to Mars. She's out back counting stars.
And so first and foremost, I would say that the most obvious aspect is that it goes back to the entire debate over creation versus evolution. And this is not just a flimsy notion of how outer space makes God seem far away instead of directly above us, although I do believe that to be a factor. But just categorically, it's not difficult to realize that in order to propose the idea that everything we see came from some big bang in the ancient primordial past, you would need to defend the idea that the cosmos is still in a state of vast outward expansion. Everything has to be moving, and the Earth that we live on is just some tiny little fleck, basically just some tiny little particle coming out of that explosion, that cosmic explosion. Even though when we look up into the night sky and see the luminaries circuiting the sky above us in a very precise, predictable path, night after night, year after year, century after century, nevertheless we're taught in school that they're actually in fact moving away from each other at breakneck speeds, and it's only because the distances involved are so incomprehensibly massive that we just can't see these deviations with our casual observation. So don't trust your lying eyes, just trust the science. And when I first began to grapple with the question of a stationary enclosed Earth versus a spinning ball in a void about 10 years ago, I was forced to come face to face with questions that I had not considered before. One of the biggest being one known as the distant starlight problem. Now, if you haven't heard of it, the distant starlight problem is the name that's been given to this paradoxical predicament that arises when you're trying to reconcile the belief in a young Earth model, as the Bible describes, with the simultaneous belief in a universe that is billions of light years across. And so this is something that a lot of conventional creationist ministries have tried to grapple with or sweep under the rug in various ways, and the more I looked into it, the more unsatisfied I became with their ability to deal with it, because it was like this glaring contradiction in their entire paradigm, right? They believe in a young Earth, roughly 6,000 years of history, as the Bible tells us, but then they believe in billions of years of distance. This is a problem. As we all remember from our public school indoctrination, a light year is a distance that allegedly travels through outer space at the course of one Earth year, which they claim is approximately 6 trillion miles or 9 trillion kilometers. And so when astronomers claim to be viewing a celestial object that is, say, 13 billion light years away, then what we are supposedly seeing is the appearance of that object as it looked 13 billion years ago. This is why when they talk about Hubble and the James Webb telescope, they talk about it being like a time machine and looking into the past and all this stuff, and looking all the way back to the days of the Big Bang. In other words, the entirety of modern astronomy is predicated upon the assertion that the universe in which we live is, at the very least, billions of years old.
Billions, billion, trillions, trillion, million, billion, 400 billion suns.
And in a constant state of flux or cosmic evolution.
We find that we live on an insignificant planet of a humdrum star, lost in a galaxy tucked away in some forgotten corner of a universe in which there are far more galaxies than people.
But if the Earth isn't moving or spinning, but instead the luminaries are what move above us, then it suddenly becomes virtually impossible to suggest that such a system could have exploded itself into existence. No matter how many billions of years ago you tried to claim it happened, everyone would see that as absurd. So once we grasp the fact that Copernican cosmology is inseparable from the assumptions of cosmic evolution, We then have a solid foundation from which to begin to understand all the ways that the other assumptions and narratives, and indeed the mind control programming that is layered on top of this foundational assumption. So it's important to get that first. This point also helps address the common misconception that in order for us to be deceived about the shape of the Earth or the nature of the firmament above our heads, then, millions of people would have to be in on it. Just as Metzger kind of suggested in that clip, like all the ship captains and airline pilots would have to be consciously lying about the shape of the Earth. I mean, this is simply not true. Any more that it could be argued that everyone who believes in Darwinism actually knows that we didn't descend from primates, but they're just consciously lying about it. I mean, we don't think of evolution in that way, that millions of people would have to be lying to us knowingly. No, they've just been programmed and they believe the lie. They've been deceived. And I think that connection just can't be emphasized enough, because with evolution we see there's a measure of self-deception. There's a measure of wanting to believe it because of what it then leads to. Now, I do have to say that I certainly do believe that a certain select portion of people within the broader, transnational hierarchy striving to create a one-world government, a certain segment of the cabal, let's say, must inevitably know that at least certain aspects of what we're taught about the nature of our world are false. Case in point would be the astronauts pretending to be going 17,000 miles an hour around the Earth when they are clearly not. How they justify that in their minds, whether it's just the paycheck or how all that works, I have no idea. When it comes to faking space, clearly the people faking space have to know on some level. I'm pretty sure Elon Musk knows he's not going to Mars, but again, I have no idea what percentage of people that is. Most people within the space programs don't know that they're faking space. Okay, that is an important thing to kind of understand. And so that's just within like NASA and the other space programs, but certainly on the level of like ship captains and airline pilots, this is just demonstrably not true. Yet it's sort of ironic that it's also true that a shocking large number of airline pilots and people with like maritime experience in either the military or transoceanic sailing, stuff like that, now do believe that there is no measurable curvature. And that everything to do with navigation and, the telemetry of ballistics and stuff like that is all based on the assumption of a flat plane and all calculated accordingly. And if you want to see more on that, I recommend this video of 28 pilots confirming flat Earth. It's 3 hours worth of testimony from airline pilots and the guy who flew F-16s in the Air Force, and you'd be amazed like how many pilots are actually like realize, but they all tell you like, oh, I never thought about it until somebody mentioned flat Earth and I thought it was crazy, and then I started, really thinking about it. And the whole issue of airlines flying flat when they're at altitude, you can spend hours and hours looking into information, and it is one of the biggest evidences that there is no curvature. So check that out if you haven't. But the question of curvature is paramount in the overall discussion, and so it's not hard to see why many of the detractors and the debunkers, they want to minimize and deflect away from it any way they can. Because simply put, if there is no measurable curvature, then we cannot be on a globe. Simple as that.
And what you're seeing here is a mirage.
The question of measuring the curvature actually played a massive role in my own journey of eventually concluding that we can't possibly be living on a spinning ball and we're not hurtling through a vacuum. So, having briefly addressed that matter, as important as I would argue all that is, I want to come back to the why question and how that's occupied, the majority of my attention over the topic and the role that it plays in connection to so many of these other conspiracy topics. Now, as a Christian, not only was I forced to recognize that the description given in Genesis of the creation was not reconcilable with the Copernican notion of the solar system, it also quickly began to make sense out of many other things that we find in the Bible that mainstream science has attempted to ridicule and dismiss as mythological nonsense. When you really step back and think about it, the idea that the land and sea that we all move on is actually all built on a massive literal flat plane, just like we experience life in our immediate everyday surroundings, it's honestly not that weird, or even controversial, or even all that difficult to scientifically prove when you compare it to so many other claims made by the Bible. It's really like pretty low on the crazy meter, because not only does the Bible tell us that everything was created by a God in heaven in 6 literal days, a God whom we cannot see with our physical eyes, and that human beings were the crowning piece of that creation. But it also unapologetically affirms the existence of spiritual entities, angels and demons, which, they have a different composition and dimension of existence than we do, yet they overlap our physical world and can interact with us, some in the service of the Almighty God and others in the service of a being called Satan. And that's something that we've all heard a million times in our life, the idea of angels and demons and spiritual entities. And so, compared to the idea of flat or round or, whatever is going on outside the firmament or above the sky, in terms of cosmological models of the Earth, one Earth where there's just human beings in the physical realm, scientific materialism, and another paradigm that says, oh, there's all these invisible entities. If you already believe in the existence of invisible entities, you've already kind of stepped into a realm that science thinks is absurd. Until you realize that it actually does allow for the existence of such beings, so long as you don't put them in a biblical framework, but we'll get to that later. But when you stop to consider everything that the Bible says about God, creation, heaven and hell, angels and demons, sin and redemption, miracles, prophecies, visions, and, of course, the unfathomably audacious claim that Jesus is the Son of God who came to earth, lived as a man, to die on a cross for the sins of the world, and then rose from the grave, so that we who believe in him may have everlasting life. Yeah, does the idea of the earth simply being an enclosed home created for us to live in, just as the Bible seems to describe at face value, does that really seem very insane by comparison? What are the most insane claims made by the Bible? That the earth was made for us, or that all of these other beings and all of this other history, and that God came down to earth and lived as a man to save humanity from our own sin and rebellion? Which is the more outlandish claim? I mean, could this be why so many people have stopped and reconsidered verses like Isaiah 40:22, where it says, "He stretches out the heavens like a tent to dwell in," and then concluded that the most logical interpretation of this verse would be to compare the heavens to a tent, which is stretched out like a roof over flat ground? I mean, it's kind of like Occam's razor here, right? But, okay, getting back to the why question and how this connects to so many other topics, that we call conspiracies. Much like the Bible tells us quite plainly that the earth was created for man, and that we were given dominion over it, the Bible also tells us very plainly that this perfect paradise was broken due to the involvement of a lying, non-human entity described as a serpent in Genesis 3, and later revealed to be a fallen angelic being known as Satan, the devil, the dragon, so on. Some people will say they're not the same thing. I believe it's all the same character. And from Genesis to Revelation, this fallen angelic being, along with his host of demonic entities, his army of demons, they are constantly striving to oppose God, by way of seducing mankind away from him and sharing their fate, sharing their damnation at the end, that's been sentenced to be carried out at the end of mortal history. In Romans 1, it explains how man himself also conspires against God, exchanging the truth of God for a lie, and constantly turns towards worshiping elements of the creation rather than the Creator. That would be Romans 1:18-32. So simply put, the biblical framework for understanding the various conspiracies we see unfolding in the world today, whether in the realm of politics, religion, science or technology, or whatever else, consists of understanding that there is an interplay at work between Satan, whom the Bible calls the god of this world, and fallen humanity. That is the backdrop of all the conspiracies. In fact, in Matthew 4:8-10, Satan tries to tempt Jesus by offering him all the kingdoms of this world. And Jesus doesn't respond by pointing out that they're not Satan's to offer. He responds by quoting the commandment to love the Lord your God and serve him only. And conveniently enough, the symbol of the pyramid with the all-seeing eye, which today everyone is now quite familiar with, it depicts the same framework. The occult secret societies who have adopted this symbol down through the centuries, they're openly displaying their allegiance to the god of this world, Satan, who bestows temporal power and riches to those willing to serve him in the hierarchy of earthly affairs. It's reflected even in their own symbolism. This is how the Bible describes the world and the god of this world and the systems of this world, the kingdoms of this world. The Bible talks about the world over and over and over again. Everything we see going on today involving the effort to create a one-world system, the efforts to further the ideologies of transhumanism and push humanity towards its next quantum leap in evolution, is all predicated upon that original lie of Satan in the garden recorded in Genesis 3, where he said, "You shall be as gods." So the theory of evolution is not merely some dry, abstract ideology adopted by quote-unquote secular individuals who just want to rationalize their desire to live out their own personal lives however they see fit. Evolution is the essence of mystery school teachings held by the elites who work in Satan's pyramid. Let me say that again. Evolution is the essence of the mystery school teachings. In Revelation, it's called Mystery Babylon, held by the elites who work in Satan's hierarchy. Evolution and apotheosis are the same lie. They're two words for the same thing. For the bulk of the 20th century, a lot of people thought scientific materialism and atheism was like the driving force of anti-Christian influence in the world. But what I've come to realize is that in reality, that was only a short phase of the broader deception that's gone on for thousands of years. The recent invention of the Big Bang fairy tale and Darwinian social engineering theories, they paved the way for a worldwide religion of humanism that swept across the entire earth under this guise of, quote, science, or scientism, the religion of science. And ever since COVID, people have come to grasp this on a level that just seemed almost unthinkable in the years just right before it. And I kind of see that as just this amazing outpouring of God's grace upon us to really see just how it really does amount to religious worship at the end of the day for so many people, that they don't question the priests and the prophets and, the almighty church of science, regardless of how insane their mandates and their contradictory declarations may be. But when man becomes the measure of all things, because he thinks he lives in an evolutionary universe where he evolved out of star stuff, he effectively becomes his own god. Whether he acknowledges belief in anything described as spiritual or not. But we are spiritual beings, ultimately, and the mechanical emptiness of raw materialism won't satisfy most people for very long, and so we've seen a massive shift back to a longing for some type of spirituality. It's described as sort of like a reawakening or the re-enchantment, back to ancient forms of paganism and mysticism, while the traditional biblical worldview continues to be ridiculed as, superstitious and scientifically absurd. And ironically, it was only when I began to dive into the flat earth topic and compare it to mainstream cosmology, along with all its various subcategories of astronomy and physics and sociology, and then on to the more speculative fields of quantum mechanics and even simulation theory, it was only then that I began to appreciate the real hubris and hypocrisy of so-called modern science. Because all these science experts like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Michio Kaku, they'll scoff and mock the idea of an all-powerful God who created everything, but they'll turn right around and have no objections to the possibility that our entire reality is just some massive simulation running on the computer of, an alien teenager in his basement or something. And I begin to just marvel at this. How on the one hand, modern educated people react with horror and revulsion and ridicule at anyone who dares ponder the possibility that we might not actually be living on a spinning sphere in space. But then those same people seem to have no problem at all when someone like Professor Nick Bostrom of Stanford can stand up and suggest that not only the globe, but everything comprising the alleged vast reaches of outer space are all nothing but a giant cosmic hologram, bits of information residing on some universal computer mind. People freak out if you suggest that SpaceX could be faking rocket flights to the ISS, but then Elon Musk can say that there's only a 1 in a billion's chance that we're living in base reality. And somehow that's not objectionable. And it might even be the musings of a genius, In other words, it's like if you say space is fake and created in a Hollywood basement, then you're a crazy conspiracy kook. But if you suggest that the entirety of the universe is just an alien simulation, or an illusion created by our collective cosmic consciousness, or a hologram being projected from an infinite number of possible realities within the matrix of quantum potentiality, that's all fine. Nobody cares. Nobody cares if it's all just an illusion or just a simulation. And that continues to baffle me to this very day. But really, after I had traversed just a short ways into those arenas of quantum physics and simulation theory, the mockery and the ridicule aimed at those of us who'd consider an enclosed biblical earth just felt like a joke unto itself. Really, it became transparently obvious that the quote-unquote scientific elites, who insist they know so much about the universe and how it all works, they aren't offended whatsoever by the most fantastic theories or speculations imaginable, so long as they don't involve the existence of an external creator God who has authority over us and the definitions of morality. So, the delusional dream of conquering space, colonizing the solar system, building Dyson spheres to harness the energy of a thermonuclear sun, or developing cryogenic sleep pods to enable trips to the distant planets. All of these fantasies are more or less just narratives designed to fuel the age-old desire to transcend human limitations and become like God. So outer space can thus be understood as a type of fictional backdrop for endless Luciferian parables, which people walking around down on Earth can internalize and justify their desire to live without the oppressive God of the Bible, who literally looks down on them from above, as the Bible says. It is also the paradigm which propels numerous globalist agendas, such as the quote, green economy to combat climate change, and the supposed need to keep the population in check so as not to outgrow the limited resources of quote, spaceship Earth. It is not a coincidence or an accident that the modern environmentalist movement really took off in the early 70s as soon as the famous Earthrise photo was supposedly taken from the moon. Earth Day, with its occult invocations to Gaia, was created in the immediate aftermath of the Apollo missions, which appropriately were also named after a pagan deity. Indeed, you can't have globalism without a globe. It's pretty straightforward. In the 50s and 60s, the government narrative was all about how we have to get to the moon first in order to beat the Soviets and establish our dominance in space. And as soon as those Freemason actronauts planted their flag in the moon studio dust, suddenly the need to build a moon base and have a permanent station up there was somehow no longer a priority, and everyone had gotten bored of it, or whatever their excuse was. We destroyed all the plans, or whatever. Instead, it all immediately switched to this narrative of international cooperation, starting with the Apollo-Soyuz docking missions. That was in 73, I think, or from 73 to 75. All of a sudden, it was all about working together. We don't need to go to the moon. It went from colonizing the moon to building an international space laboratory in low Earth orbit, where all the nations could supposedly conduct science experiments in zero gravity and harvest the inevitable scientific breakthroughs that would supposedly follow, all while gazing out the window and peering down onto the magnificent blue orb below. It became all about looking back down on the Earth. The marvelous blue marble, which became the icon of all icons, the most ubiquitous symbol to populate the zeitgeist that we were all reared in. The symbol that you have seen more times than any other symbol in your life. If you want to talk about propaganda and mind control, this is like the mothership, the mother of all propaganda symbols. From the 1970s until the present day, we've been steadily fed a diet of images portraying the quote, fragile Mother Earth, a world with no borders, a planet protected by a tiny thin layer of atmosphere, protecting us from the harshness of the cold outer void, a world which seen from above from the perspective of the overview effect, as NASA coined it. Look up overview effect. And this overview effect that requires us to learn how to have a global mindset, rather than a selfish, ignorant, nationalistic one. They literally came up with a name for the effect of their propaganda. They literally coined a phrase for the desired change that is supposed to happen in the mind of the people being subjected to this mind control. It's called the overview effect. And it's admittedly a pretty horrifying realization to come to the conclusion that this most iconic image that was so long was regarded as the most definitive example of our alleged collective achievement as a human species is in fact an indispensable component of the greatest MK Ultra PSYOP of all time. I'll grant you that. It's a lot to swallow. It's pretty insane. But in fact, I look at it now, I see it as the icon of eugenics. I see the symbol of humanism itself. It is the iconography of the one world system. It is the icon of the New World Order. It is literally a new world view programmed into the minds of billions of people, designed to justify everything from a centralized digital economy, total surveillance, forced medical procedures, population control, synthetic food production, coerced urbanization, social isolation, gender fluidity, which is, self-sterilization, weather modification. I mean, virtually every globalist agenda that has been exposed and decried ad nauseum over the past several decades. And that's only touching upon the external physical realm of politics and economics. On a deeper level, on a spiritual level, the belief in a vast universe full of star systems where life can potentially be evolving alongside of us, or before us, in endless different variations and ways. This allows for the belief in the existence in, quote, extra-terrestrials of every conceivable form. And it's not even necessary to explain how much we've been bombarded with media and material over the course of our entire lives, involving the prospect of, everything from little green men, to the alien greys, to alien entities that have evolved beyond the need to even inhabit physical bodies at all. Some ethereal, AI entities that have transcended physicality altogether. Kind of like a spiritual being, right? There is not a single concept that was formerly resigned to the realm of metaphysics or the paranormal, the occult, mysticism, that today cannot be represented through the lens of science and science fiction. I mean, who out there today has not heard the famous quote by Arthur C. Clarke about how any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic? That maxim has now so thoroughly penetrated the public consciousness that there is nothing from the demonic traditions of witchcraft that cannot and has not been repackaged as something possible within the boundaries of, quote, scientific inquiry. So much so that for millions of people today, they don't feel the slightest bit of embarrassment in embracing esoteric studies into magic and witchcraft, just outright. Like, to believe in Hermeticism, alchemy, Kabbalah, tarot, meditation, ceremonial magic, I mean, that's not only seen as compatible with modern scientific knowledge today, it's like the hip thing to do. It's only when you stand and profess to believe in the spiritual power of the God of the Bible and his son, Jesus of Nazareth, do people feel at liberty to ridicule your belief in a, quote, sky daddy, or other such tired accusations. They'll ridicule the sky daddy, but embrace the alternative of being some sort of, orphans in the void, who maybe one day will get to meet our long-lost space brothers. And that's totally fine. But the so-called space brothers, they've been down here with us all along. When we humble ourselves enough to put more trust in what God has revealed through his word than through the vain imaginings of man, we can know the why behind the conspiracy. The conspiracy to obscure the true nature of the world, and all the other conspiracies as well. In fact, even a small child can understand it. The beauty of the gospel is that it's simple enough for a young child to accept and believe it, and yet so utterly profound that you'll never exhaust its mysteries if you live beyond 100 years old. Deep down, each of us knows that we will face the end of this mortal existence sooner or later, and the dream of exploring the heavens has tantalized man for thousands of years, with the hope of escaping this limitation of mortality. And the fallen entities who war against heaven and against man have been fueling this delusion for just as long. They've been lying to humanity for thousands of years about where he came from, where he can eventually go, beyond the constraints of this material world, if only he sufficiently develops his knowledge of himself and the rules by which the universe functions. The Bible tells us, on the other hand, that on the fourth day of creation, God put lights in the expanse above us, to shine light upon the earth, and to mark the signs and seasons and days and years, a celestial calendar or clock, and a provision of light to see by in relation to the day and night time. It was all created for us, and to serve as a reminder of the magnificence of His creation. As it says in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky proclaims His handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them He has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, and there is nothing hidden from its heat. Remember, there was no Hubble telescope when David wrote this psalm. There were no telescopes at all, in fact, no space programs or satellites or anything that we have today that was supposedly enabled us to understand so much more than what was previously only visible to the naked eye. Yet God declared back then that the skies proclaimed His handiwork. It was not merely some poetic description of the firmament given to those primitive generations who hadn't yet developed the tools to supposedly view the heavens as we can today. He did not declare that only in the distant future would man be able to fathom the awesomeness of what He had made for us. The heavens have been proclaiming its speech to the ends of the earth since creation began. This too is a big part of the why question, perhaps the biggest part. It's the simple trick of erasing people's ability to recognize the signature and handiwork of God that is shining down upon us day in and day out, testifying to His love, mercy, and provision, and also testifying to the fact that one day the heavens will be rolled back like a scroll, and the Son of Man will return through the clouds in the same way that He ascended, and come back to judge the world, and gather those who belong to Him. The devil will be removed from the earth, along with all the lying spirits and all those who served them, all those who worshiped the creation instead of the Creator, and sought the forbidden knowledge they offered, instead of the knowledge of God that has been made available to everyone willing to accept it.
We know intellectually, as Sandy was talking about the difference between the intellectual knowledge that we live on a planet and the implications of that fact and how it would influence our decisions in daily life. There are also a number of common emotions and feelings. Chief among them was the sense of the fragility of the planet and the felt need to protect it. This was one of the primary reasons for the forming of the Association of Space Explorers, the astronauts' own organization. As well as this related sense that they talked about of returning, feeling for the first time a citizen of the planet rather than the locality of their origin. So as Frank mentioned, they frequently felt a strong sense of kinship or commonality with the peoples of the Earth, using phrases like, "we're all in this together." And there are hundreds of such statements from other astronauts, which we've been working to compile and to publicize. Frank also documented many of their predictions that these effects would create huge social changes once this understanding and this perspective and the experience itself began to percolate through our culture. And we certainly today have remarkable new technologies for doing that, both the internet and modern media systems and increasingly sophisticated simulation and virtual reality systems, which are needed in order to get this across. Let me quickly list some of the most important ideas that I want to leave you with. First, from hundreds of astronaut statements, we know that the overview effect is a very real, interesting, unusual, and potentially profoundly moving experience. As Frank and I have said numerous times, neither he nor the Institute invented the experience. We're simply researching and extending the reports of the astronauts themselves. Frank coined the term, and that's given focus to it so that we can study it as a subject. Secondly, this is not just an experience of the legendary beauty of the Earth and the understandable awe and wonder of seeing the universe directly. Rather, there is a subtle shift in the very makeup of the mind of the astronaut. So subtle, in fact, that it may go unnoticed for some time, overwhelmed by the very barrage of sensory experiences that produces it. Or it may have a very quick and sudden change. Both have happened. Third, there are more familiar experiences that also produce shifts and changes in a person's mental makeup. Some of these, which Frank has termed overview analogs, are multicultural travel, extensive education, strong physical experiences such as wilderness trekking, deep sea diving, ocean sailing, mountain climbing, and the like. Not to say that they produce the same thing, but they produce a sudden shift that changes a person's worldview. Many of these analogs have been studied by cognitive brain-mind scientists. This is my field. And we've applied these findings to the space experience directly.
After I came back and tried to understand what this experience was all about, I could find nothing in the science literature about it and nothing in the religious literature that I looked at. So I turned to the local university and asked them to help me with what I saw. And when they came back to me a few weeks later and said, well, in the ancient literature, we found a description called salvakapa samadhi. And they said that means that you see things as you see them with your eyes, but you experience them emotionally and viscerally as with ecstasy and a sense of total unity and oneness. And I said, well, that's exactly what the experience was. And so it's rather clear to me as I studied this, it wasn't anything new, but was something that was very important to the way we humans were put together.
Many of the great wisdom traditions of the Earth have pointed to what we're calling the overview effect. That is to say, they have realized this unity, this oneness of all life on Earth and of consciousness and awareness.
Within the Western tradition, I think it's quite new and quite shocking because there's been much more of a sense of separation. But if you look at other non-Western cultures, especially in Asia, the emphasis on those has always been on realization that the self and the world are not separate from each other, but that they're really interconnected, that the individual self and the species as a whole is a manifestation of the larger whole.
As you go into your mind in a contemplative way, the sense of the living reality of the planet becomes obvious. You become more in tune with the natural world. This is very akin to the direct perception that the astronauts had. So it's no wonder that many people have likened the overview effect to a spiritual or meditative experience, although it's not exactly that. It's a cognitive shift that very often can produce a kind of meditative experience.